Soon after their arrival in the Western Hemisphere, Spanish conquerors toppled the Aztec and Inca empires and established two main centers of authority in the Americas: Mexico, which they called New Spain, and Peru, which they called New Granada. Each was governed by a viceroy who was responsible to the King of Spain. The viceroys were kept in check by courts called audiencias, where all their administrative actions were subject to review. Spanish America was a multicultural and ethnically mixed group of people. At the top of the social hierarchy were peninsulares, Europeans born in Spain. There were also Creoles, people of European descent but born in the Americas. Mestizos, a mix of European and Indian blood. Native Americans. Mulattoes, a mix of European and African blood, and African free and slave labor. Silver was the most abundant American treasure, and much of Spanish America's enterprise focused on the extraction of it. Silver production concentrated in two areas: the thinly populated Mexican north, particularly the region around Zacatecas, and the high central Andes Mountains around the stunningly rich mines of Potosi. The mining industries of Mexico and Peru powered the Spanish economy in the Americas and even stimulated the world economy of early modern times. Spanish galleons traveled back and forth to Spain with cargoes of silver, where 1/5 of the silver went to the crown, called quinto. After 1565, Spanish silver also traveled back and forth in the Pacific. This route was first discovered in 1521, when Ferdinand Magellan's crew crossed the Pacific and made contact with the Philippines. In 1565, Spanish mariners inaugurated the Manila Galleon trade between Manila, Philippines, and Acapulco, Mexico. Apart from mining, the principal occupations in Spanish America were farming, stock raising, and craft production that took place on estates called haciendas. Life also revolved around missionaries. The Spanish built and often settled in colonial cities that resembled cities back in Spain. Thus, many Native Americans in the Spanish Empire on the mainland were able to preserve their native tongues and many customs. This is not the case in the Caribbean. When Spanish mariners first arrived, their initial interaction with native peoples occurred in the Caribbean. When the Spanish arrived, an estimated 4 million Native Americans occupied the islands. Most prominent were the Taínos of the Greater Antilles Islands. On the smaller island chains of the Lesser Antilles were another group of people called Caribs. Christopher Columbus and his immediate followers made the island of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic, the base of Spanish operations in the Caribbean. Columbus's original plan was to establish trading posts, but the Caribbean offered no silks or spices for the European markets. They then attempted to mine for gold after panfills were discovered in the River Haina on the island of Hispaniola. The Spanish recruited laborers from the Taíno. This was done through the institution of encomienda, which gave encomenderos, Spanish settlers, the right to compel Taínos to work in their fields and mines. Conscription labor was a brutal business. Quotas were set for Taínos with the penalty of losing an arm if they did not produce enough gold. The problem was there just was not enough gold in the islands to meet the Spanish thirst, despite entire mountainsides being stripped for mining. Taínos occasionally rebelled, but Spanish retaliation was deadly. By 1515, Taíno populations were on decline on the major islands of Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. After 1518, waves of smallpox epidemics would wipe out the Taíno. The only surviving pieces of their culture left were a few words: canoe, hammock, hurricane, barbecue, maize, and tobacco. After the mid-16th century, the Caribbean became a sleepy backwater of the Spanish Empire. In the 1640s, French, English, and Dutch settlers began to replace the Spanish in the Caribbean. They made the islands profitable by turning the land into plantations that produced cash crops like sugarcane. Planters then began to import African slave labor. By the 1700s, Caribbean society consisted of a small class of European administrators and planters and large numbers of African slaves. Plantation slavery and sugarcane production had been established first in Portuguese Brazil. The Portuguese acquired Brazil in 1492 with the Treaty of Tordesillas with Spain. However, Portuguese interest in Brazil did not begin until after they began planting plantations along the coastline. By 1530, they began to import African slaves. Sugarcane required extensive labor, and life in Portuguese Brazil revolved around the enguejo, the sugar mill. Africans were not introduced to North America until 1612. Unlike Spanish and Portuguese colonies, the French, English, and Dutch operations were more of private investors. The French established colonies first at Port Royal, Nova Scotia in 1604 and Quebec in 1608. The English established their foothold with Jamestown, Virginia in 1607 and the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. The Dutch had originally settled New Amsterdam in 1623, but lost it when the English seized it in 1644 and renamed it New York. Cod fishing and the fur trade, fueled by the demand of beaver pelts back in Europe, got the French, English, and Dutch colonies started in North America. However, in 1612, the English began planting tobacco in Virginia, and the plant quickly became a cash crop. In a few short years, Europeans were hooked, and tobacco helped establish plantations in the North American South. By 1750, 120,000 blacks raised tobacco on the Chesapeake, and another 180,000 cultivated Carolina rice.